In the late 1930s, when the specifications for the national defense tankers in the US were being drawn up, three main types would eventually emerge. But of those three, the first two that were settled upon were the T2 type, which we covered previously, and the T3 type. Essentially, the primary difference between the two was that the T2s were primarily intended for behind-the-lines work, getting oil to and from bases and the like, although in the end they did actually end up serving extensively in supply fleets. The T3s, on the other hand, were supposed from the start to be faster and built stronger to bring them up to the standards that were expected of true naval auxiliaries. This meant they would be able to keep up with the fleet at cruising speed and theoretically take at least a small amount of punishment, although given that they were tankers full of flammable liquids, it was generally hoped they wouldn't have to take any damage at all. But the additional hull strength would also help in rough weather and the like, as well as reducing maintenance costs. The need for additional speed would mean a larger power plant, and therefore a larger ship, in order to both reach that speed economically and to retain a useful oil capacity. That latter was especially important since, as originally planned, the T3s were supposed to be subsidised vessels that would typically enter service with commercial oil companies and then serve there unless and until a war called for them being taken into military service. The initial plan that was sketched out called for 10 ships to be built, each one capable of 18 knots thanks to 13,500 shaft horsepower supplied to twin screws via turbines. There was, of course, no real armour included, since they were tankers, but provision was made for the mounting of several heavy anti-aircraft guns and a number of smaller weapons, should they be called into service, and as things turned out, this settled into a light and medium anti-aircraft battery of 4 twin 20mm and 4 twin 40mm anti-aircraft guns, and in the first ships, 4 single 5-inch 38 guns, with later ships carrying a single 5-inch 38 and 4 single 3-inch 50 calibers instead. Although initial plans had called for 10, this was quickly increased to 12 before the design had actually been completed, and thus 12 hulls were initially laid down. These would eventually be classified as AO-22 USS Cimarron through to AO-32 USS Guadeloupe, although most of them would have commercial names before naval service. Displacement was around 7,500 tonnes empty, but almost 25,000 tonnes when full, which included no less than 146,000 barrels of oil, although this was only 5,000 barrels more than a T2 tanker, which represented an increase of only about 500 tonnes in deadweight. The other 2,500 tonne difference was of course made up of extra hull and the much larger machinery plant, plus of course the armament once they're in war service. 9 out of the 12 ships in this first batch would have very brief civilian lives before the imminent clouds of war saw them taken into US Navy service, but the first 3, the Cimarron, Neosho and Platte, entered service with the US Navy directly as it was recognised there was a significant shortage of fast fleet oilers and that needed to be immediately addressed at least somewhat. Shortly after the US was catapulted into World War II by the Pearl Harbor attacks, 4 of the ships, the Sangamon, Santee, Shenango and Suwannee, were taken out of service for conversion into the Sangamon-class escort carriers. Now that might seem doubly confusing, as a shortage of fast fleet oilers was to plague the US Navy for the next couple of years, but also because 2 of those left over as oilers were the Sabine and the Salamone, either of which could have offered a consistent S name pattern for the Sangamons, but there you go. But you do have to remember, at the time, there was a huge demand for emergency carrier flight decks. That's also where the Independence class came from, and the T3 hull, as it turned out, actually made for a pretty good escort carrier. But fewer fast oilers meant that the fleet was considerably more vulnerable to any one of those ships being lost, and in this case, the first to go would be poor old USS Neosho. She'd been a somewhat bemused spectator to Pearl Harbor, as the Japanese had focused on the old standards either side of her and completely ignored the potentially actually far more valuable fast fleet oiler. She can be seen here getting underway even as Battleship Row burns behind her and the poor old California in the foreground has already taken on something of a list. But about half a year later, the Japanese caught up with her while she was supporting the Yorktown and Lexington at the Battle of the Coral Sea. She was alone, apart from the destroyer Sims. A recon flight mistook her for one of the American carriers, and she was subsequently bombed. Although, credit to her designers, she did stay afloat for quite a while, which enabled a number of the crew to be rescued, despite the fact she was, a blazing tanker, and then she was eventually sunk by naval gunfire. Seeing the utility of the type, and obviously also fearing further losses, another 23 Cimarron class would be ordered over the course of the war, with only one other ship, as it turned out, the Mississinawa, being lost to enemy action, in that case a Kai-10 suicide torpedo attack right in Ulithi Harbour in late 1944. There were also 5 slightly different Mispillion class that were built right at the very end of the war. None of the class would return to civilian service, though, all being kept in the US Navy. Most were decommissioned and scrapped in the early 1970s, but 8 ships, 3 original flavour and the 5 Mispillions, were jumboized in the mid-1960s when the fate of the class as a whole was under consideration. This refit added space for another 93,000 barrels of oil, courtesy of a significantly expanded hull, and these ships would serve until the end of the Cold War, with 6 of those then remaining in varying states of reserve through to the 21st century, with the very last, Mispillion herself, finally going to the breakers in 2012 at the grand old age of 67.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.